I'm going to step a little bit away from health and talk about some of the research that we've been doing that's more closely related to problems of social inequality, income inequality in the United States, but I think that you should keep in mind throughout the presentation that all of this is very closely related to health. That having a healthy upbringing, having a healthy adulthood is vital in both having, moving up the economic ladder, but also having the opportunities for kids to do well in school and to lead healthy lives. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about to start is the American dream. And you can think about the American dream in a lot of different ways, but we're going to look at one particular metric to sort of get an idea of what's been going on in the United States. What we're going to think about is the odds that a child that is born into the bottom fifth of the income distribution in the United States moves to the top fifth of the income distribution. So you can think of this as sort of a rags to riches story. What are the odds that somebody that is born poor ends up wealthy later in life? And what we can do is we can compare this across countries. And what you can see here is that the United States is actually not doing very well in comparison to a lot of peer countries that you might think are comparable. So the United States, 7.5% of children that are born into the bottom income quintile, the bottom 20% of the income distribution, will end up in the top 20%. Now, you can think of this as sort of a number that we would expect to range between 0% in a society where your income is perfectly determined by your parents, and 20% in a society where a kid can move from any point in the income distribution to any other point in the income distribution. And with that in mind, I think that you'll see that these differences are pretty stark. So in the United Kingdom, for example, a child that is born into the bottom income quintile has a 9% chance of moving up. And if you look at Canada, a child that's born into the bottom quintile has a 13.5% chance of moving from the bottom of the income distribution to the top of the income distribution. One way that you can sort of put this in perspective is that the chances of achieving the American dream in the United States are only half the chances of achieving the American dream in Canada. Right? That's a pretty stark message, and something that I think that we need to be thinking about a lot moving forward. So, what I've showed you so far is the differences across countries. But it actually turns out that there's a lot of differences within the United States as well. And this is something that we can potentially do a lot about by targeting policies to particular areas. So what I'm going to show you is some research that I and other colleagues, including Raj at Stanford, have done to try and map the metric that I just showed you across rural and metro areas in the United States using de-identified administrative data from 10 million children born between 1980 and 1983. And so what I'm showing you here is a color-coded map that is the same metric that I just described. And you can see that there are very, very stark patterns. So a child that's born in San Jose, for example, has a 13% chance of moving from the bottom income quintile to the top income quintile, something that's comparable to the best countries that I showed you on the previous slide. But you look at a place like Atlanta, a child that is born in the bottom income quintile has a 4.5% chance of moving to the top income quintile. That is lower than any country in the world for which we have data. Any country in the world. And you can see that there are pretty clear patterns by geography, which tells us that this is something that potentially we can try to address using policy, right? You see that areas in the southeast tend to have low rates of upward mobility. Areas in the Midwest tend to have high rates of upward mobility. And areas on the West Coast tend to have high rates of upward mobility. And I think that understanding why this is the case and what sort of policy interventions we can use to try and address these problems is going to be a really key area of research moving forward, and something that I think everybody should be talking about. Now, I think it's easy on the previous map to look at the broad sort of patterns across the United States, but in fact there are some very particular patterns even at very small localities. And so what I'm showing you here is, again, the same metric, the chances of moving from the bottom of the income distribution to the top of the income distribution, or the San Francisco and San Jose Bay Area. So I've broken it down by county here, and you can see that in a place like Santa Clara, growing up at a place like Santa Clara, a place like San Francisco County, is a very high opportunity area. People have a really great chance. If you think that the upper bound here is 20%, people have a great chance of moving from the bottom of the income distribution to the top of the income distribution. But you go right over the county line into Alameda County, and you see that that chance is halved. Right? Across the county line, Santa Clara to Alameda, your chances of moving from rags to riches is halved. And I think that that tells us that we can potentially look very closely at local policies to try and get at what's going on here and try to make changes. Now, one thing that you might think is, oh, different kinds of people live in different counties. You know, somebody that has parents that are good along other dimensions that maybe want to, read to their child more as they're growing up or invest more in their child's health when they're a baby, that they might move to Santa Clara versus Alameda County. And so what we've done is we've done an analysis to try to understand to what extent the differences that we see are based on different kinds of people living in different places versus an effect of the actual place that they're growing in. That is something we can change. And so I'll give you an illustrative example to show you sort of what we've done and make the key points. So imagine, to use round numbers, that a child that's growing up in Oakland, in Alameda County, on average as an adult will make $30,000 a year. And imagine that a child that's growing up in San Francisco County will on average make $40,000 a year. Now what we can do is we can look at children that move between these two counties at different ages to try to understand whether it's the effect of the place that they grew up, the place that they moved to, or something else to do with their family. And so what we see is that for children that move at age 9, their income as an adult will be right in the middle, right around $35,000 between Oakland and San Francisco. So that is a child that lives half their childhood in Oakland and half their childhood in San Francisco will have an outcome that is right in between the outcomes in Oakland and San Francisco. And one thing that we see that is really interesting and in some ways encouraging is that this pattern declines as a child gets older. Now the way to think about this is a child that moves from Oakland to San Francisco at a later age will look more like the children that grew up their entire lives in Oakland than they will look like children that grew up their entire lives in San Francisco. And I think that there's some really deep patterns here that are important to try to understand and inform the kinds of policies that we can try to use to address these problems. The first is that it seems that most years of childhood between ages 9 and ages 23, which I'm showing on the graph, actually matter roughly equally in terms of income later in life. So what that means is that spending an extra year in Oakland compared to San Francisco at ages 10 versus 11, or 15 versus 16, gives you the same effect on your income later in life. What you can think about it as is an exposure, right? You are exposed to something that's going on in, say, Santa Clara County, Oakland County, San Francisco County for another year, and that brings you 1 year closer to being like the children that grew up in that time. I think the other interesting pattern here is that it seems that after age 23, moving doesn't really matter. And what that tells us is that we should be focusing on the childhood environment, right? It's the places that these kids grew up that is really where you can move the lever on their outcomes later in life. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the work that's done as part of this group is so important, is by targeting interventions to children that are growing up, you can make a big difference in all sorts of outcomes later in life, including but not limited to income. And so one thing that is natural to ask is, what do the places look like that look like San Francisco County or Santa Clara County versus Oakland County? Can we identify these places that are good at that? And what kind of characteristics do they have where we might be able to start to change policy? One area that is very visually striking is different types of segregation. That is, places that are more segregated tend to have worse outcomes for children. And I said that this is easy to visualize, and so we've done so. So what I'm showing you here is a map of racial segregation in Atlanta, one of the places that I showed you earlier with very low rates of upward mobility. And we've colored, using census data, one dot for each person that lives in the greater Atlanta area, where people that are white are blue, people that are black are green, and so on and so forth. And what you can see immediately is that Atlanta is a very segregated city, right? The green dots live separately from the blue dots, live separately from the red dots, right? There is a lot of segregation. There's not a lot of integration in Atlanta. You can compare that to a place like Sacramento. Sacramento has the same share of all of these minorities as Atlanta. It's got the same shares, but you can see immediately that it is much less segregated. The different colored dots are much more interspersed. People that are different from each other are living together more in Sacramento than they are in Atlanta. And what we find is that places that look like Sacramento have high rates of upward mobility in an economic sense. Places that look like Atlanta have a low rate of upward mobility. So I'll show you 4 other factors that we've found to be really important in trying to understand which places have high versus low upward mobility. One is places with a lot of income inequality tend to have low rates of upward mobility. Places that have unstable family structures, so a large percentage of, say, single mothers, for example, tend to have low rates of upward mobility. Places that have good social capital, which is sort of an academic term for the types of networks and the strengths of bonds that people form with their community. Those places tend to have high rates of upward mobility. And finally, school quality is something that I think comes immediately to mind to everybody. It turns out to be very important as well. Places that have good public schools tend to have good high rates of upward mobility for the children who grow up there. And I think that one thing you can look at this list and think about is underlying a lot of this is health, right? Places that have healthy kids, have kids that do well in school, have teachers that can teach well to children that are showing up to class, and we see in the data that that leads to high rates of upward. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit now is a very specific way that we can start to think about moving the needle on some of these issues among a very broad set of potential options, but I think one that's particularly relevant in Santa Clara County. And that's focusing on innovation. Specifically, we're going to focus on patents. So what I'm plotting here is the fraction of children that grow up to earn a patent later in life, compared to the income of their parents while they were growing up. And you can see that children that grew up with poor parents are much less likely to grow up to file for and earn a patent. Whereas children that grow up at the very top of the income distribution are much, much more likely, 10 times more likely, to file for and receive a patent by age 30. Now you can compare this trend to the same children's 3rd grade math scores to try to get a sense of whether this is a true difference in ability or is this a difference in their environment growing up. And so by looking at 3rd grade math test scores, we're starting to get at this issue. And you can see that for children that are sort of above the 85th percentile in their class for math in 3rd grade, they are also much more likely to grow up to earn a patent, as maybe you would expect. So now we can look at the comparison between these two. What this graph is showing is the same thing that I just showed you, but breaking apart high-income kids versus low-income kids. So the blue line that I'm plotting is the fraction of kids that grow up to earn a patent if their parents are in the bottom half of the income distribution. The red line is the fraction of kids that grow up to earn a patent if they come from the top half of the income distribution. And I'm comparing this to their third grade math test scores. And I think what jumps out, if you think about this chart, is that looking at the far right, you can see that among kids that are high achieving in third grade, it's the ones that grow up wealthy that are more likely to earn a patent, not the ones that grow up poor. What does that tell us? It tells us that you have to be more than just talented to grow up to earn a patent on average. It's not enough to just be smart. It also helps a lot to be wealthy, right? And I think that that tells us something really deep about the kinds of things that we want to try to change if you don't think that that's something that we want to have in our society. So what I plotted here quickly is a similar map to what I showed you before, but plotting the differences in patent rates across the United States. And you can see the different places in the United States, based on income in particular, have very different rates of children growing up to earn patents. One thing that is really interesting about the data here is that children actually, if they grow up in a place that, say, people tend to file a lot of patents in microchip technology. Children that grow up in that place are much more likely to grow up to file a patent in microchip technology in particular. Now, what does that tell us? It means that your childhood environment matters in a lot of ways, right? It matters for the income that you're going to have as an adult. It matters for the type of work that you're going to do. And it tells us that if we can change the exposure of kids in childhood to innovation, to other types of potentially beneficial interventions, that we can do a lot to help these kids grow up and succeed. So what I'm going to end with is trying to think a little bit about what the trends are. I told you at the beginning that we were focusing on children that were born between 1980 and 1982. So what can we say about the children that are growing up today? And while we can't obviously look at the, say, 30-year-old income of a child that is 18 right now, what we can do is we can look at all of the factors that I showed you before and say, how have those changed? How do we think that mobility has changed based on the factors that we've already identified as being important? And what we can say is that the Bay Area and Santa Clara County, San Mateo County, do not look as good as they did 20 years ago. Right? There's work to be done. That places that previously had lower levels of segregation now have higher levels of segregation. And I think that this is encapsulated well by this Atlantic article from earlier this year that is making exactly this point, that the Bay Area has changed a lot, in many ways that are good, but also in some ways that probably are not so good. And if we want to be thinking about providing opportunities for the kids that are growing up in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, Alameda County, San Francisco County, what we want to be thinking about is reversing some of those negative trends and thinking more about investing in children that are growing up. So that's all I have for you. I'd love to take any questions.